Well, hello and welcome to another noble attempt at Theology Thursday. Valiant, even. I am Pastor James Smith of Trinity Episcopal Church and St. John's Lutheran Church, both in Three Rivers. Joined, as always, by the in and unimitable Pastor Chris Laughlin of Messiah Lutheran Church, Constantine. How are you today, Pastor Chris?
I'm doing well. You just helped me break down inimitable. Thank you.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I'd never thought about
That
it.
can't be imitated.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
Yep.
Thank you.
Tune in next week for Inimical.
We do have so a little bit of background, pull back the curtain a little bit for our audience. I had suggested that we talk next about whether soldiers too can be saved, and Pastor James said we can do that because I know you just came back from vacation, but at some point I'd like to circle back around and cover the other 15, 20 treatises. And I said, no, you know what? Let's hold off on whether soldiers too can be saved for, like Memorial Day or 4th of July or something. And let's circle back to one of the other ones that we haven't covered yet. And we both agreed, what is it? Babylonian Captivity of the Church. And that's kind
the
of
other one,
long,
yeah.
I think, right?
That's really long, yeah. It's so long that Luther changes his mind about the number of sacraments halfway through. This is a real thing. We'll get there next week.
We'll get there next week. Yeah, is that the one that in Luther's works takes up the whole volume? Well, that's Bondage of the Will, isn't it?
Yeah, that one definitely does.
So in any case, we came back to, and yes, this is the full title, To the Christian Nobility of the German Nation Concerning the Improvement of the Christian State. And we learned that at least in the annotated Luther, it's almost 100 pages long.
Yeah, so here's a Latin word for you. Mea culpa. It means my bad.
That wasn't what I was going, honestly, not what I was going for, no, Pastor James.
Because I literally texted you and I said, we should do Christian nobility. It's not as long as the other one, but I did at least put IIRC, if I recall correctly. I did not. It's really freaking long too.
And that's okay. And we're going to cover it, I think, briefly, right, Pastor James?
Yes, we're going to do our best.
And I'm going to clean this up later, just so you know.
Okay.
And I'm going to try as needs be.
Go ahead. Yes.
So if you audience hear or see things jump around, it's because I cleaned it up later. All right. So background: we are 21st century Americans, and we have words like separation of church and state and freedom of religion, which are really, shorthand for the non-establishment and free exercise clauses of the First Amendment of the Constitution. They don't have that. Luther doesn't have has no concept. This is 100 years or so before the Treaty of Westphalia, more than 100 years, I think, before the Treaty of Westphalia. And the best they could do then was quaes regio, eis religio, his region, his religion. But that didn't mean freedom of religion. That meant the prince or whoever it was that controlled the region controlled what religion the people in that region worshipped. So Luther, as far as Luther's concerned, Christendom is very much a real thing, and there is no delineation between church and state in Luther's time. That's not even a concept for them. And so it's kind of jarring as someone who's very much into the First Amendment of the Constitution, that first freedom granted by the Bill of Rights, to read this. Even if I'll be honest, I skimmed parts of it because, as we mentioned earlier, it's 100 pages long. Mm-hmm. But there is definitely a growing sense of nationalism. He is very much appealing to the Germanness of his audience.
Which is ironic in the sense that I think there were like 300 principalities that Germany was divided into around that time. But you're right. It's especially a sense of nationalism versus those Romans, that are trying to steal steal our land, steal our money is really what he sees as behind a lot of Roman policy.
And he actually refers to them as Romanists.
Right.
So
because I mean, for Luther again, he would say that he is the Catholic Church and they are not. That's another thing that's different to our ears is, you know, we think Catholic Church, we think Pope and all, or maybe even the Creed and it's everybody. But Luther would actually say, no, people following me are Catholic and the people following the Pope are not. So that's just another difference there.
And then you wanted to talk, I think, about the three walls that he sets up pretty quickly in this treatise.
Right. Yeah. So a little background is basically this is we've talked. There's most of this treatise is a long laundry list of reforms that Luther would like to see. That he blames Rome and specifically, I'd say again the avarice of Rome, which was manifest. Like people, the entire reason you would become a bishop back then, and I'm not exaggerating, is you would get what was called a benefice, which is all the income that was produced on that territory that year, you would get a cut of it. So you had bishops that didn't actually live in the territory or the diocese that they theoretically
bishoped
served. And this is why, so this leads to the indulgence controversy too, because Albrecht of Mainz wants, I think, his third bishopric, his third benefice, which you talk to a bishop today, Lutheran, Catholic, or otherwise, Episcopal as well, they'd be like, why would you ever want that? That's so much work. Well, it's because he wasn't doing work. He was collecting money from the land. So it's a pretty good gig if you could get it, is what I'm saying. And so the problem is, though, Luther, to go back to Albrecht, that's the reason he has to sell indulgences, is this was a lucrative trade and he wanted the bishopric. So he had to take out a loan to be able to buy that from Rome. That's how Rome made off, as people bought these titles, these offices. And it's kind of an investment because then Albrecht can go make money himself. But he has to take out this loan, he has to pay it back. That's why he has to sell the indulgences. That's how the whole Reformation got started 3 years before this treatise is written. So why is he writing to the Christian nobility of the German nation? It is because by this point, he has already utterly despaired of the idea that Rome, the church, is ever going to actually fix itself. In fact, he has this... I'm laughing because it's typically Luther harsh. He has this letter that he wrote previously where he says, and this is kind of seen by many as the decisive break between Luther and the church, "And now farewell, unhappy, hopeless, blasphemous Rome. The wrath of God has come upon you in the end as you deserved, and not for the many prayers which are made on your behalf, but because you have chosen to grow more evil from day to day. We have cared for Babylon and she is not healed. Let us then leave her that she may be the habitation of dragons, specters, ghosts, and witches, and true to her name of Babel, in everlasting confusion, an idol of avarice, perfidy, apostasy, of cynics, lechers, robbers, sorcerers, and endless other impudent monsters, a new pantheon of wickedness." So you can probably tell by that if there's going to be reform, he's given up on the Pope. It's not going to come from the Pope. So he's appealing to secular authorities, and this is where, Pastor Chris, what you were talking about really comes in, that they viewed this as something that could happen. You think about the Emperor Constantine, who's still regarded as a saint in the Orthodox Church, and it's because he used his secular authority to empower the church. There's also a lot of, in Germany, there's a long history of emperors who acted to either call councils or establish the Christian faith in the territory. So there's a long tradition he's appealing to here. It's been kind of out of power for a while because the papacy the last several hundred years has grown more and more powerful. The reach has grown, and he's kind of calling back to that. Now, that's all to say, you asked about these three walls. What are the three walls? Well, let me read how he sets it up. It's basically a justification for why can the princes even do this? Why should I think they have this power? And the Romans have three walls they've put up that says they shouldn't. So he says the Romanists, again, which is the Pope, have very cleverly built three walls around themselves. Hitherto, they have protected themselves by these walls in such a way that no one has been able to reform them. As a result, the whole of Christendom has fallen abominably.
Can I stop you there and just
yeah, I need a break anyway.
And just point out, I just wanted to point out that the words reform and reformation figure prominently in this work.
The first wall that they have that you can't do this is very basic. It is that that secular authority is subservient to ecclesiastical authority. So the church, it's not church and state, church separate from state. The way Rome would have you believe it is the church above state, at least in Luther's time. And I wonder if that still might be in the, we don't need to get into current understanding. So the reason the state can't reform the church is the state only exists by the ordinance of the church. This is not historically true. Like, as we said earlier, like Constantine really made it a safe place for the church.
Or even after him, Theodosius I, who makes Christianity the official religion of the empire. I'm also thinking about Charlemagne, who insists on being coronated by, I believe, a local bishop. Now that's to give Charlemagne some legitimacy,
right?
But it's also like, it also legitimizes the church, and Charlemagne will in some ways protect the church.
And that's one of the so Charlemagne is also one of these German emperors. Literally the Charles the Great is what the name Charlemagne means. So he's the guy Charles V in Luther's time is named after. He's kind of hearkening back to that. But yeah, so he has a real role in propagating the church. This idea that the church crowns the princes is also, of course, the church wants to use that to say they have the ultimate authority. One thing that was going on, by the way, is that the church, if they were unhappy with the prince at the time, they could not only excommunicate the prince himself, although of course they could do that. They could excommunicate his entire territory, as it's called an interdict. And it actually happened to King John in England in the 1300s. And you can imagine this is a pretty big power that you have, because it was like for several years, masses could not be said. They only had baptisms. People had to be, I think, buried like in unconsecrated graves. You can check me on that one. But it was kind of a way of the church trying to fight back again. You can see this temporal, which is, again, temporal is like, think earthly. These earthly powers like the state and the church are butting heads. But the fact they have to go to this kind of extreme measure, I would say, means that they really don't have the power, because they're trying to get King John to do what they wanted him to do in the world, and he kind of fought back and said, this isn't your domain. Not a great king, but doesn't mean he was wrong all the time.
That's the first wall.
That's the first wall. Have we got any more to say on that, or do we want to go on?
No, I think you covered it. All
right. The second wall is the Pope's unique authority to interpret Scripture. Do you have anything you want to say on that? Because obviously he's going to blow that apart.
Yeah, and they point to, what is it, Matthew 18, right? And then I give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And when Jesus turns to Peter and says, I give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And scholars debate this one today, but back then that was interpreted to mean Peter, was as the head of the church, and that baton had been passed on from pope to pope, and popes then are the ones with the sole authority to interpret scripture. They raise the objection that only the Pope may interpret the scriptures.
Yeah, which, again, Luther, of course, is. I think this is one of the things he's known for, and this brand is known for, is that it's not just the Pope interpreting scripture; it's allowing scripture to speak for itself, interpreting it together as a church. Okay, yeah, but I will say he also attacks that understanding of Matthew 18. He says, number one, Jesus is talking about forgiving or binding sins, not scripture. That's a little debatable, is my understanding, based on what's actually being said, because binding and loosing is kind of a rabbinical understanding of the law and how tightly you hold the law. But his bigger point is that this is not addressed just to Peter, but to all of the disciples. And even if it was addressed just to Peter, that doesn't mean that when a pope's clearly doing so many manifestly wrong things, that he continues to have that unique authority given to Peter. So it's kind of a non-starter for him. And do we want to get to wall number 3?
Yeah, I mean, so it's my understanding that this is not about so much the binding and loosing of sins as it is so much about the binding and loosing of the law. But
right,
we could get into the definitive. What we need to know now is that Luther was challenging the Pope's sole and unique authority to interpret Scripture.
Right, and I'm just saying, I think the Pope, I think he's wrong, because I don't think he meant. I don't think Christ meant that the Pope is the only one who gets to interpret Scripture, but I do think they're right on the narrow question. I think in John 20, which we recently had in church, Jesus is clearly talking about binding and loosing when it comes to sins. I don't think that's what he's talking about in Matthew 16.
I agree with you. I will say this. So Luther didn't want the Pope to have the sole authority to interpret Scripture, but when Luther gave the Scriptures to everybody and they interpreted the Scriptures differently than he did, they were suddenly very wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. And this, I think we should get into that. That could be a different show, but what happens when your Reformation succeeds too well?
Oh, that's good call. Good call. We'll come back to that.
Yeah, that could be the name of the show. Yeah, so wall number 3. This is boots on the ground. This is the actual problem, if you ask me. So traditionally, the Pope is the umpire, like in regular times, but the ultimate authority is a council, which is like the Council of Nicea, for instance. And the Pope's made this very clever move, which you have to applaud their hubris and ingenuity here, because they said that only a Pope can call a council. So it kind of is a way to get the Pope ahead of the council, because as soon as, first of all, there were many times when there was an issue, such as the papacy, like when we've got 3 darn popes at the same time, which happened, that it's clear a council needs to be called, but a pope is not going to call that unless they think they're going to win. The funny thing about that, they actually, I forget which pope it was, actually did call a council to resolve this controversy. But then a funny thing happened against him, even though he had picked all the people and he declared the council illegitimate. He said that they didn't have authority to depope him, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's
one of my favorite stories.
And by the time they do finally, because there are people calling for a council, and eventually after this, they do call a council. But when they call the council, it's specifically to condemn the Reformation.
Right. Yeah. And they're not debating any of these. So Luther wants a free council, and what he keeps free and evangelical, I think, are the words he uses. And what he means by that is we can debate all these issues, and we're not going to constantly be like, is that okay? Is that okay? Can we talk about this? And I think this is actually the argument where Luther just completely blows it to hell, the wall, because Nicaea was called by the emperor. So, the Pope was barely involved at the Council, the greatest council that there is. Yeah, so I was saying I think it was a bad self-serving argument by the Pope that only he can call a council, and I think Luther drives a Mack truck right through it. having knocked these walls down, that allows him then to make his arguments to the princes about specific reforms. We've got a couple we want to talk about, but I think it's important to talk about those walls, because the idea of even doing this was highly contested. And in some ways, once you've said the Pope is not, but these Christian princes can all get involved, like as the people were represented or thought of back then, which is the princes. And then the rest of this letter and the rest of the Reformation is really issue by issue. How is this transfer of authority going to play out?
So let's talk about some of the individual complaints. I mean, it looks to me, Pastor James, like a lot of this, and I mean a lot of this, is about money. And it's not even just about money, it's about money and nationalism. Like Luther is clearly appealing to the German prince's sense of Germanness, but also their own sense of self-preservation. And the Romanists are coming for your stuff.
Right. And that's about 40 pages, if not more.
No, seriously, I think it is. I think it's like 40 pages of the Romanists are coming for your stuff.
And it happens through things we've talked about already, like benefices, like indulgences, and a lot of other terms that we're not familiar with these days.
There's buying, selling, bartering, exchanging, trading, pretense, deceit, robbery, theft, luxury, whoring, knavery, and every sort of contempt of God. Well, he never holds back, does he?
No.
Let no one
whoring and knavery at the end there after all those financial white-collar crimes.
Let no one accuse me of exaggeration. It is also open that even in Rome they have to admit that their state of affairs is more atrocious than anyone can say. I have not yet stirred the real hellish dregs of their personal vices. Mind you, we are more than 40 pages into this thing.
Yep.
Extort through indulgences, bulls, confessional letters, butter letters, and other confessionalia. All of this is just a patchwork. I don't even know what half that stuff means.
Yeah. So I think we could say there's a large section of this that's literally white collar crime, right? And what are some of the other things? I think you want to talk about priests a little bit, right? Because that's a big part of the issue.
So I think Luther's developing some serious theology here that he'll come back to later, and not too much later, by the way. I think he starts developing the priesthood of all believers, and I think that's been in the works, but he really begins to lay it out here. He also lays out the marriage of priests and goes on for several pages about how important it is that priests not just be allowed to marry, but that they actually marry. And something you mentioned in a previous show, Pastor James, about how priests were essentially allowed to have a woman on the side. This was actually encouraged at times by the bishop. And so now the priest, Luther will actually say, you got to feel bad for these priests who have a wife and a kid, but aren't allowed to acknowledge them or care for them.
Right.
I think that's a really interesting, I mean, Luther he appears so angry at times through much of this, I would say. And then there are times when he really comes at it from a more pastoral perspective. And that's one of them. I thought it was
I mean, God in the Bible appears angry, like when people are being mistreated. And
I'm not saying Luther's wrong.
I think we can. What's that?
I'm not saying Luther's wrong to be angry. I just for him to switch so suddenly to feel bad for the priests, dude. I'm like, wow.
I mean, I think it's fair to say it really was a racket at the time. Like and I will be the first one to say you cannot simply treat Roman Catholic Church with the 21st century Roman Catholic Church. Like, most of these abuses, it's like, tell me where he's wrong.
And as I mentioned in the pregame, he has seen some of these close up. I think in a lot of this, he's referencing, or at least thinking back to his own trip to Rome, his own pilgrimage, when he experienced some of these things firsthand. I also thought it was really interesting. He eventually goes into a list of all the things, and he numbers them nicely for us. I think there's 27 in total that the princes should do, some longer than others, and many of them connect it in sort of flow in logical order, although I think he could have condensed it at least a little bit. Um, but number 25 is that the princes need to set up schools. They need to have education, and this one really surprised me, for both men, for both little boys and for little girls.
Yeah. And this, by the way, is really a Lutheran legacy as well. If you look at women's rights in a lot of the traditionally Lutheran countries, this still holds. You can test me on this. They're quite a bit further ahead, or were earlier adapters than many of the Roman Catholic countries. Like it's really, if you want to talk about kind of secular legacies of the Lutheran Reformation, there are some negative ones, don't get me wrong, but that's really a positive one, I think, is women's education.
It's also something he will develop further, but just 4 years later, to the councilmen of all cities in Germany, that they establish and maintain Christian schools. That's actually the title of the letter, 1524.
Yeah. And I want to, as long as we're talking about priesthood, I just want to say, as an interesting understanding of the priesthood of all believers, which is that everyone is equal before God, and whether you are a priest, a bishop, a cardinal, a pope, it doesn't matter. That is an office that you hold, and it doesn't make you above a person or better than a person. It gives you a specific job to do for a specific period of time, which by the way also means people can't jump in and try to do the job that you have been assigned or the office you have been assigned to hold. That's not what priesthood of all believers means. It's about equality, and what it's really pushing back against is this idea that when you and I were ordained, we received an indelible mark. It's a technical term, and it's still used in Rome, Episcopal Church, Anglican Church, I believe the Orthodox Church as well, that basically you are marked forever and a part of you is changed when you are ordained. Lutherans have a much more time and especially office-bound understanding. Once we are retired, we are the laity, and that's a total difference. You wouldn't have like a Pope Emeritus in the Lutheran Church, for instance, for a couple of reasons, I guess.
And let's touch on that because we'll get back to it, I think, in a future Theology Thursday. But there is actually an ontological change in sacraments. There is a change in being. Something has irrevocably changed.
Right. So ordination is very different from baptism in that way.
Or
for Lutherans.
Right, for Lutherans. That and I would say that there is a strain within Lutheranism which is starting to tend that way. Someone told my wife after she was ordained, they've given you something, you have been given something that can never be taken away. Yeah. That's just wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. You'll also hear people joke about magic hands with communion. I have hands like the rest of you mortals. If you cut me, I will bleed. That's not it at all. It's that I have been assigned on behalf of the community to say the words of institution and to steward the sacrament.
Because ultimately,
yeah, and that's actually another thing as well. Go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
Because ultimately, they still belong to God. Please continue.
Yeah, no, for sure. And they're given by God. They're entrusted. They're stewarded to the community. Not to the specific priest. And the other thing is when it comes to ordination as well. This has really gotten blurred because of our deal with the Episcopal Church, which I'm very thankful for. Let me say, but we don't believe really that the bishop has some unique authority to ordain. And that's a difference from some of the other churches, which is why we have bishops ordain our pastors now in order to be in communion with the Episcopal Church in particular. But Luther will say, he has a great image, like, if you were stranded on a desert island and there were 12 of you, and there was no bishop, would church just stop? No, everyone would get together and appoint a person, set them aside. This is exactly how it works. The community will get together and set someone aside for the roles of preaching and the sacraments. And so he says when bishops ordain, they are one person representing the community. That's how they're to be understood. It's not that there's something special about their bishopness that does this. They're speaking on behalf of the community is the idea.
I think we've covered it, Pastor James.
Any profound takeaways on this one?
I am out of profundity today.
Yeah, I would just say that there's a lot in this one. What is he doing? He's trying to chip away at those walls that the papacy's built around itself. And that's going to allow him to make moves on all of these issues throughout his career and play both the theological and the political games here. But first, he has to undermine these unique claims of authority that the Pope has made. And that's how I would understand these 120 pages. If I'm wrong, write about it in the comments.
On Facebook, because I don't think there'll be any comments on the YouTube version.
Okay. Roger that. Thank you.
And shall we do the treatise on good works next week, Pastor James? Also,
I thought we were going to do Babylonian captivity, or do you want to do good?
Babylonian captivity of the church. Sounds great.
Yeah. Tune in next week for the thing that was considered even longer than this. And happy Easter.
Happy Easter.